Welcome back to the Sober Thinkers channel. My name is Michael. I want to thank you guys for tuning in again with me today, those who are returning as well as those who are here for the first time. And in today's subject matter, we're going to be talking about a subject titled Why My People Fail and Why They May Fall. And in this subject, I just want to basically touch on a few things that I feel that greatly affect my people as a whole, and as well as the fundamental advice that I feel would help us kind of go forward as a culture. Now, for starters, as a black man being raised by both my grandparents, my father, aunts, and uncles alike, I've always been proud to be such. A black man coming from the most southern and rural parts of the country, experiencing, so to speak, the culture within a culture. There was nothing like it in my opinion, and there was never really a time that I wished or desired to be anyone or anything else. The people I met, the relationships forged, the lingo, etc., can't be fully described as to the level of impact it had upon me growing up, especially during the era in which I did. I got to both see and experience so many different things from a basic standpoint, as well as people and economic diversities. You had poor people, those of an average nature and situation, sort of like my family, those in the middle, and of course those that were quite well to do and well more advanced and further along than others. Yet there seems to be an unspoken commonality among us, and that was an overall cultural mindset that seemed to toe the same party line that no one dared to challenge, address, or disturb. Now, Hosea 4:6 states that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee. However, without making this necessarily religious argument, we can view or liken this particular form of knowledge as one that which consists of facts, information, and skills acquired by one through some level or form of experience, education, or training, and two, a certain level of familiarity, awareness, and or understanding of one's environment and the various nuances that it consists of, be it places, people, things, etc. Now, we all would consider ourselves to have some level of knowledge of some sort on a myriad of subjects, be it general or a specific niche. However, I'm not talking about knowledge from the standpoint simply of knowing something for the sake of knowing it. Hell, we can all do that. We know that if you jump into the deep waters without a life raft or jacket, unable to swim, that there's a good chance that you'll drown. We all know that if you play with fire, you'll get burned, touch the edge of a pointy sharp object, that you'll get cut to some degree or another. But I'm not talking about that kind of knowledge. I'm talking about the kind of knowledge that goes well beyond the surface level. For in my humble opinion, there are really two types of knowledge which entail the two I just mentioned. Surface level, which pretty much any and everybody can see with their own two eyes, and thus takes no type of mental effort to decipher. Then there's that which goes well beyond the scope and or surface on down into what would be, or what would appear to be, the unending depths, or go up as high as the heavens, the kind that takes real mental effort to not only discover but to consistently stay abreast on at all times, and as well as all of its moving parts, as there are many. I'm talking about an above average awareness and an understanding of our own cultural and economic environment, as well as spiritual things that has the bulk, like 99% of us or our people, in the overall state of affairs in which we find ourselves. And although some of us, a very small percentage, have a much better grasp on this level of knowledge and awareness, it's not nearly enough of that which is necessary or needed to really aid and assist our people, leading them out of the current state and condition we're currently in. So what is it that we need to have knowledge about and or be aware of that we don't already know? I'm talking about the knowledge of oneself, and not that bullshit mumbo jumbo, but the intentional, purpose-filled awareness, knowing that seeks to fully and completely understand their position and place within this society and world from an overall cultural perspective, as it relates to the areas of much needed adjustment and improvements necessary for the full advancement and upliftment of our people. I'm also talking about a keen and heightened sense of awareness about things going on within and around you, in both your immediate and distant environments, and how these things relatively affect our people as a whole. We fail because we don't pay attention to the details, which are usually right in front of our faces, hidden in plain sight the whole entire time. And of course, I'm not talking about some type of conspiracy theory type shit, because the truth be told, whether these things exist or not, and to what extent, is irrelevant at this point, because even if so, as a race, we are of course light years behind, and have been so for a while, and have been done quite the number on from both a national and global perspective. And who wouldn't retain that level of power and control if they done so over such a people for such an extended period of time? Because through all the claims we lay hold of in regards to that which we supposedly know, it's funny how we get exposed for the exact opposite, showing that we have no understanding or knowledge at all, when the same old trick plays are being ran on us constantly, generation after generation, only a new and improved formation, just a different look. Now, one of my favorite books to read of all times is titled The Miseducation of the Negro, written by Carter G. Woodson around the 1930s or so. And in this book, he does go into great detail as it relates to how our people were purposely misled, misguided, and of course miseducated. Now, what does the term miseducation mean? In general, in more basic terms, it means poor, harmful, and an all-out wrong education and or teaching. Furthermore, the type of education that's purposely designed to detour, misguide, and all out throw you off of a course that would otherwise lead to a more fulfilling, productive, and prosperous life, which is what education has always laid claim to or is supposed to be about. Now, in this text, the author speaks in depth as to how blacks at that time, as well as now, were being culturally indoctrinated rather than being taught. And in this case, indoctrination being the process of teaching us blacks to accept a set of cultural beliefs uncritically about both themselves as well as the ones doing the indoctrinating, which, as we can obviously see, had a devastating impact that has affected generations both past, present, and future. Now, the author suggests several key points that I'll now mention as follows. That one, the Negro has been taught to love, respect, and revere everyone and everything except himself. That the notion of inferiority has been drilled into our minds or our conscious minds, so much so that it gives rise in him or us in almost every aspect of our lives. That practically all of these successful Negroes in this country are of the uneducated type, of that which have had no formal education at all. For the large majority of them who have put the finishing touches on our best colleges are all but worthless in the overall development of our people, in his opinion. They never became a constructive force in the development of the race. He suggests that we mustn't simply view our current condition from the viewpoint of the defects as they appear today, for these things must be viewed in their historical setting or historical context. That the so-called education of the Negro college graduate leads them to throw away many opportunities which they have, and to go on in quest of those which they do not find. In other words, the Negro's education is not taken back or used to the benefit of their own people. Instead of learning how to use the system to the benefit of it and upliftment of its own people, the Negro has opted that the only means of bettering his condition is by means of socialism, which is the overthrowing of the present economic regime and replacing it via the inauguration of popular control of resources and agencies which are now being operated for personal gain, thus cultivating the mindset of taking what someone else taking what someone else has from them, as opposed to doing the hard work and creating your own prosperity and upwards mobility that would carry on into future generations. He suggests that we became too comfortable with the notion of codependency on others and less concerned with the dependency upon self due to an extreme lack in the ability to both think and do for ourselves as men. Instead of real freedom-giving rights, we opted for benefits and privileges instead of striving to have, build, and maintain our own platform/foundation so that we could not only possess real sustainability and an unmatched level of self-empowerment, as well as something that would last for generations to come. We chose to adjoin ourselves, both willingly and in some cases gleefully, to another's platform and system, only to be able to carve out what little we could from within that structure, or even worse, be given as a portion unto ourselves what we are only deemed worthy of receiving or stated to have by those who lay claim of ownership to that system or structure. For it's one thing for a man to have his own land outright, land deed, title, taxes paid and all. And then there's another thing when you're the one looking to carve out a space for yourself, having nothing of your own to possess, and thus having to look to another man for some of or a portion of what he has. For in this scenario, he who has his own has all the bargaining chips, leverage, control, and ultimately power, and you're nothing more than a leaf blowing vicariously in a vicious windstorm, having to go and be led wherever it takes you, unable to control any part of your own destination/destiny whatsoever, thus suffering the inability to take, choose, or chart out your own course based upon what's best for you and your people. For we are not taught to both respect, undergo, and appreciate the role of apprentice/apprenticeship, where which we can both learn a skill via trial and error and then become the master of such or said skill. Instead, we are taught to look down upon it, viewing it as something that is beneath us, all while other races undertake such pursuits with right attitude, learn to develop and master their talents, then go on to become, in most cases, highly proficient and productive members of society, ultimately adding to the uplift or the upliftment and future sustainability of their own people. Now, lastly, if the Negro or our people, highly educated and all or not, would forget most of the untried theories taught him or her via the indoctrination process of so-called education, if he would see through the propaganda which has been instilled into his own mind and fall in love with his own people and begin to sacrifice for their uplift, many of the problems that currently and continue to plague the Negro constantly would diminish significantly. Now, mind you, this commentary was written in 1933, many moons ago, which suggests that we as a people have come far enough on some levels and have had more than enough time to put at least some of these issues to rest and have put some type of dent in our current situation. For I am more than willing to admit that our conditions up to this point and juncture have had a great deal of outside influence behind it and an orchestration and execution of such attacks that have come against us. And yes, we have been wronged on so many levels that it would be highly ill-intended of me to overlook such a thing. Now, to some, all I appear to be doing thus far is verbally tearing our people down with no form of positive reinforcement/upliftment. This harsh critique is more than warranted. It's downright necessary as far as I'm concerned. Although I'd agree that some level of positive reinforcement is needed as well. For the things we are doing right can be used as a fundamental foundation to build upon and as stepping stones to progress forward. However, what do we or should we expect from a group of people that has abandoned its very culture at every part and position, at every post and position, men, women, and children alike, and have thus left both their present and future fate in the hands of uncertainty or over to the will of another that doesn't have their best interest in mind, nor wishes to see such a progress or such a progression come together for this particular group of people in such a way that it shifts the very paradigm or dynamic upon which this entire system was built and still continues to function. That, I believe, would be a very scary sight for some, if not mostly all, to see this group of people awaken in such a way, move in such unison, in such a manner, with a laser-like focus / purpose-driven intent from which we do not or refuse to deviate away from, in such, in a sense, representing one heart, one mind, one spirit, with the intent of pulling each other up, with everyone playing their respective roles. Because in some ways, it may even threaten the very existence of those that seemingly have the societal advantage, and ultimately from a subconscious standpoint as well as conscious perspective, people cannot handle the idea of their current position of prominence and influence being taken away from them, the tables being turned, and another gaining a foothold they once possessed. But for some odd reason or another, we will not make any real effort or attempt at such a feat, as if we're somehow afraid of what may be on the other side, something that would be totally different from what we both see and experience as a cultural whole and or are accustomed to. Not to mention the fact that it would also require us to do the very thing that we seemingly hate most, and that's both use and raise our intellect, allowing it to do the heavy lifting for us, similar to the power of levitation, not just acting, playing, or pretending to be so, and thus operating in the false sense thereof, because both your actions as well as the results prove to be the ultimate tell sign as to where you really are on the scale or barometer of progress. Instead, we choose to opt out and wallow in the muck and the mire like a massive group of filthy wild hogs in a hog pen, seemingly loving that state or condition. Therefore, the onus and delivery of ourselves from such a created mess is and will continue to be on us, for no one will aid, assist, or rescue us from our current or potential fate save ourselves. And in order for us to do this, everyone must get their heads in the game fully and out of their asses, of course, with a powerfully forged commitment to reestablish fundamental order amongst our people as it should be. And it does start with the proper flow of order. Our men, the leaders, the tone setters, the protectors, the providers, the power brokers, so to speak, of our culture. For we are the ones, as it relates to the fundamental construct of any given prosperous society or nation, charged with protecting the pack and that which is in the best interests of it, being able to both have and maintain a certain level of wisdom and discernment in order to properly guide and govern the affairs of not only that of themselves but others as well, especially those regarding their own or your own people. And in order for us to do any of these things, the most important action above all else, in my humble opinion, need be taken. And that is for us to grow the fuck up in our minds and move out of this childlike state that we seem to be forever stuck in. For far too many men, for far too long have I seen and continue to do so, act like children from all manner of aspects, such as thought, speech, language, communication with one another, as well as behavior. It's what I like to call the Peter Pan syndrome, refusing to come out of the childlike state regardless of the so-called facades and outward appearances, thus caught in a perpetual state of adolescence. However, this will not happen lest we the men take necessary steps to do so, and this is first done by high levels of self-examination, the proper acknowledgement of errors, accompanied by a sincere conviction of not only wanting true change, but deeming it absolutely necessary. For there was a time, I believe, when the men of our culture, although with less from an overall economic perspective, had somewhat of a reasonable level of respect for themselves, others within the culture. I believe we had some level of dignity and at least attempted to display such via the proper playing of our roles within the construct of our society. For we wanted better for ourselves, our families, our women/partners, as well as for our children, and thus made the necessary sacrifices to help ensure the securing of these things. We attempted to both train and teach our children to the best of our abilities and or given circumstances, and more importantly, we had the support of our families in seeing to it that these things were carried out as expected. Also, we for the most part were present as opposed to being absent, which is a major difference maker within our culture and families and communities. For we did not create all of these situations and leave them high and dry, only to be met with disastrous ends. You could, I believe, at one point differentiate the men from the boys in both look and action, at least for the most part. Men had at least a more open and public view / display of respect towards not only themselves but also the women. For men carried themselves in a manly manner and not necessarily in the manner of a child or a youngster, because this is what was expected of him, and not only did his life depend upon it, but that of others did as well. For there was no real room allotted for error. Men subsequently had some level of awareness as well as authority, especially when it counted most, which was in the home, along with the influence that determined the outcome of many things regarding the affairs of his household and family. However, somewhere along the way, as society evolved in its own way, both men and the role that it entails devolved drastically to a point of almost unrecognition. Now, ironically enough, it seems that when both times and conditions were better, we carried ourselves, behaved, and performed in a much different manner. Better, I'd say, because once again, we had no choice, for our very lives and livelihoods depended on it. Now it seems as though, as society itself evolved, both newly and innovative things began to be introduced to our culture as well on a wide scale. As we too slowly were integrated and introduced to these same things, we began to lose ourselves in many different ways that have proven detrimental to not only our current but future generations born into this thing as well. I believe that the first thing to go was both our pride and self-respect, whereas we once had at least enough of both to spur us on our life's journeys with a sense of purpose, determination, and most importantly, an end game. Both a worthy goal and a vision that was much greater than ourselves, that took the coming together on many different levels to achieve. This, I believe, was the beginning or the start of our current spiraling out of control. How so? Some may ask. Well, if you fast forward and look at us today, you can see how despondent we appear on both the in and outside. Men have gone from caring about their appearance and portrayal of manhood to the world from a pride and honor perspective to caring just about or a little too much about things that pertain to the so-called substance of manhood, and in a lot of ways not enough as it relates to those key things I mentioned earlier: pride, respect, and the honoring of oneself. On one hand, we have become like fashionistas, putting too much unnecessary emphasis in and on what we are wearing, how we look to others around us, in hopes to make some form of an impression that gives us or assigns us some kind of false sense of significance, confidence, or value greater than that of which we have placed on or within ourselves. In doing so, we took our minds off of the things that were and or are most important to our overall sustainability and hold the most value. Instead, we, like little children clamoring around, place our undivided attention on all the unnecessary things to obtain these useless, worthless, and all-out depreciating assets that provide no real value to our lives or overall circumstances. A lot of times, we look like one of the premier acts in a circus, i.e. clowns and jesters, always joking with the joke of the day, always looking to put on a show and entertain in hopes to gain additional fanfare or attention. Then there's those who have or take no value in themselves at all. They allow themselves to be represented in any type of way, shape, or form with no regards as to how it may come across to others. They show no pride, or they have no pride in self at no level whatsoever. Which of the two types representing mentioned, it's hard to say which of them is the worst. Now, the next thing to go was the social intellect and the neglecting of such an important thing. This was key because at one time we really cared something for our advancement and progression and gravitated towards things that helped us along the way via education, arts, sciences, literature, etc. These were all things that made us use our minds in higher levels of reasoning and intellect. Therefore, as time passed, we deviated heavily away from these things. we began to gravitate towards the things which represented the lowest common denominator of our society, things that tend to drag one down a spiraling path of desolation, depravity, destruction, and ultimately decay. We, through the means of consistent enticement and luring, took our eyes off of the fundamentals of life, which had the ability to put us on a reasonable position to level the playing field for not just ourselves, but for our people and the future generations as well. The chance to build something which had more sustainability. And instead, we opted to take hold of and gravitate towards that which had the more glamorous-like appearance, likened into a raccoon that finds a shiny object and will pretty much risk losing damn near everything to keep hold of that item. We went for all of the fancy items that consequently had no appreciating value. We became known for all of the antics as opposed to the real potential skills we could both develop and bring to the table, be it our own as well as others. We put on a great show for the world to see, but when it comes to the most important things of our society, such as real business, innovation, and influence on a massive scale, for we barely even or don't at all possess a seat at the table. It's like comparing a construction site in the heart of New York City with real architectural plans and tools to a group of first graders on a playground pretending to be on a construction site, building with Legos as tools. The two scenarios don't even come close to comparison, therefore they are worlds apart. However, we don't solely have the brunt of this responsibility to bear for the position we found ourselves to be in just solely alone, for we have had a great deal of help from both in and outside forces in destroying ourselves to the degree we have up to this point. We've had many things thrown at us, both to entice and pull us away from our responsibilities as men. They've effectively thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, at us, and it has certainly done quite the number on us as well. Now, when I say they, in my eyes, are the overall power structure that consists of many different and various moving parts. And they all seem to work in unison with one another with one common goal, and that is global domination. Having everyone and everything under the same rule, on the same page, and discarding anyone and anything that does not serve that purpose. And please believe me when I tell you that they are everywhere in every walk and facet of life. Our problem is that we either don't recognize, know, and ignore, or willingly join forces with those that set the stage for our own downfall. For as I've stated prior, we have the mindset sometimes as a child likened to a fictional character known as Peter Pan, one who is stuck in the perpetual state of boyhood, which is supported by so many different tell signs, like how we walk, talk, dress, our behavior, etc. And as Malcolm X stated in his time, tell me what other race elects musicians, comedians, entertainers, and the such as the leaders and spokespersons of their culture, the ones who set the fundamental tone for their people. But not us. We not only act like the jester and fool, we elect, promote, and elevate the same as the leaders and spokesmen of our culture/people. So on all fronts, we are both led and leading ourselves astray. We have basically assigned all of the power of our existence given to us by God and the Spirit over to those who have not our best interests at hand, nor should they in the first place, because that's our responsibility. We thus refuse to hold ourselves accountable for such a fall from grace and have become so entrenched in our current state/condition that we have no earthly idea as to how we can even begin to restore proper order within ourselves first, then the families, communities, culture, etc. Now let's move on to the women. Since my days of youth and young childhood, I've only seen one real mode stemming from the women of our culture, which appears to be true to form as it relates to how natural this form is adopted, even morphed into as a whole other animal. This includes a certain level of deviation from grace, gracefulness, humbleness, value in social conduct and character, authenticity, integrity, and the like thereof, which has helped to expedite and accelerate the destruction of all the necessary barriers that both protect and uplift a people, thus giving them a solid foundation to stand on. Instead, there has been what seems to be an intentional and on one accord like purpose-driven decision to adopt just the opposite of attributes. So instead of grace, many have chosen brashness, pride, and arrogance over humility, dismissiveness over a willingness to listen to beneficial reasoning, and an overbearing personality/social behavior that proves to be beneficial to none other than herself and to those she chooses to align herself with as well to serve their overall purpose. She too has chosen to go her own way and has thus abandoned her very role as helpmate, partner in the proper development of the culture from which she herself derives, deeming it more beneficial and necessary to join forces with another. Like the men of our culture, she too has acted irresponsibly and in a wayward manner, which is quite clear and evident with the generation that has both stemmed forth from the loins of men and through her womb that she possesses. For she too has opted to fall into such behaviors that does not serve her well, nor does it serve our people. Likened unto the men, she is also given unto selfishness, wanting to serve her own agenda and purpose rather than doing that which is best for the greater good and the whole, which is the culture in and of itself. She is adopted for a narcissistic and in some ways cutthroat-like approach in dealing with her own as well as the affairs thereof to which they pertain. She does not nurture, uplift, nor help build anything of any type of a real sustainability that would otherwise help push our people and culture upwards and into a position of prominence. Both she and the man have swapped out their fundamental roles. He now being under her authority, and she set atop of him, as if they never even knew what their roles were in the first place. Which was to build, propel, and sustain the culture of our own people in unison and on one accord, and not that of two totally separate, unadjoined, self-serving interests, which leaves the progress of our people as a whole all but ignored, with no real form of checks and balances whatsoever. Instead, you have clung to chaos among other debilitating actions and deviated further from that which brings peace and stability, for you too have sold out, and not just yourself, but your own counterparts as well, the helper, the men of our culture, as if their existence mattered not at all, and even more depressing, your own young and offspring as well. How so, some may ask? Well, the most key and relative tell sign, I'd say, is the unhealthy dynamic between the men and the women of our culture, those who are responsible for pushing the culture forward via the helping and assisting. Instead, she chooses to fight, sabotage, and stagnate any form of progress that suggests she fall back in line with the proper order of our culture, which is highly important, thus having no type of salvation-driven end-game insight. And as opposed to showing the proper and honor respect one to another as a form of good example setting to those both on the outside and inside of our culture, they do just the opposite. And what's even worse is the way each carries themselves in their respective roles, and how this pattern of behavior transfers over to the onlooker, the offspring, and the young ones. No real self-respect, respect for each other, or only the lack thereof. In this case, you have to even wonder if either is worthy of such based on current actions and behavior. Lastly, and the even more telling sign of them all, is the rearing and turning out of the offspring, both current and succeeding generations, which seem to get significantly worse over time as opposed to getting better. And what's the old adage we've constantly repeated up to this point? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He or she is a chip off the old block. Both young men and women of our culture usually turn out similar to and represent the very ones that raised them up in that manner. They pattern themselves after the very behaviors, attributes, so forth, as what they both see directly and experience. Now, although I'm not the greatest historian, nor will I ever pretend to be, based on all of our known struggles we've undergone for a significant amount of time and have come through as a people, you think that we would have developed a real sense of pride and acknowledgement of self and one another. That which we promote and produce would be of the highest grade of substance for the sustainability of our people. And as expected, us being the usual suspects, we do the exact opposite by way of the waywardness, lack of discipline, erratic nature of both the men and the women, fathers and mothers, those being raised, which are also now adults and parents themselves, have been raised with no form of fundamental knowledge of self, of culture, or fundamental training as it pertains to both being both solid and respectable men and women as to how to operate in their respective roles via the interaction with one another as well as others. Instead, the children are monitored like scientific experiments, and as long as nothing appears to be or have gone really wrong, then all must be fine or okay. There's never a true taking under the wings from its proper perspective. Men don't teach and or train their sons in the proper ways of manhood, and women most certainly don't teach or train their daughters in that of the proper ways of womanhood, nor is there a proper cross-training done as well to seal and deal on both, or to seal the deal on both ends, so to speak. Now, there are exceptions to this as well. However, if these things had been properly done and executed as they should have been, you'd most certainly would have seen the results carry over from generation to generation, with each one being better than the other. And as the saying goes, you shall know a tree by its fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit. So nothing is just accidental or happenstance. It's all as is, or as all as it should be, based on the actions taken and decisions made, or the lack thereof. And now, another highly important factor that almost no one dares to ever mention is that a great number of our youth come forth from nothing more than irresponsible acts done or carried out in the heat of passion or desires between two individuals that probably should have never formed this type of union in the first place, as harsh as that may sound. For it is more than understood at this point that both parents are critical to the raising and development of just one child, let alone multiple. However, the fathers have failed their children, especially their sons, by way of non-presence, being void of the necessary influence needed to train these young boys into men, thus being able to send them or train them on life's most important roles and functions, which include respect of self and others, the importance of pride and dignity in oneself, and the value of having and maintaining the right frame of mind in order to build, progress, and properly navigate one's course amidst life's challenges that will most certainly occur, so that in turn they can be fully prepared, develop, possessing the necessary confidence it will take to win at all costs. As well, they fail their daughters by the same notion of non-presence. Even when physically in place, there's no real strong or solid influence to which these young ladies can point to as a frame of reference as it relates to how they both perceive, interact with, and ultimately choose men. They are void of understanding on the matters of men being proper providers, protectors, and ultimately the shapers and molders of how they proceed on their life's journeys. And as I believe to have stated earlier, the father has become likened unto the child, not only in the way that they are perceived, but in the manner in which they carry themselves and behave. The men act like boys, and the boy attempts to emulate what they see from the men, deeming this portrait shown to be something repeated, which is why you see the endless cycle of a downward spiraling culture where they both are concerned. And unfortunately, young women are affected as well, based on the lack of proper bond and guidance from a father's perspective. They mimic what they see by way of choosing and drawing closer to the types that are detrimental to both themselves as well as the culture, thus repeating the cycle of a downward spiral. The same goes for the mothers in many ways as well, as it relates to the rearing and upbringing of their sons and daughters alike. For there is no real training or teaching of the fundamentals taking place, which promotes real growth, pride, dignity, and confidence in oneself. There's only a carbon copy of which, or such which, shows itself quite clearly by the overall results. Unlike the fathers, the women allow the sons to hang on and feed off the breast far past the time which should be naturally allotted. They teach them in the ways of emotional instability and erratic behavior, as opposed to that of sound perspective, which usually comes from the fundamental training of a father. Concerning the daughters, they teach them seemingly every destructive attribute that could be learned, such as cunning, deceptive, and erratic behavior, bullheadedness, void of any type of wisdom, discernment, and understanding on how to carry and present themselves in a way that truly serve the best interests from an honorable perspective. Again, being given over to lewdness, brashness, arrogance, etc., as opposed to humbleness, gracefulness, and the like thereof, all of which help build them up and send them on the proper paths of life, as opposed to that of being lost and wayward. Overall, neither child is receiving the proper direction or cross-training from either parent as should be, so that they become both well-balanced and well-rounded individuals as they approach adulthood. As a result, you now see the results from such actions, which is the utter and continual breakdown of a culture from both within and without, and thus getting passed down to generation after failed generation, with again no apparent end or much needed reversal to such a trend in sight. So at the end of the day, what is the takeaway? Well, from the perspective of certain elders that had what I deem to be a collective wisdom and discernment concerning the affairs of our people in both the current and future state thereof. The takeaway would be centered around real and true upliftment, self-reliance, and self-preservation at the most fundamental level. But in order for any of these things to happen, there must be a real and true change/paradigm shift both in and around the hearts and minds of the people on such a scale that I'm not even sure if such a thing were even capable of happening, because such a task would require a sacrifice that most are not willing to make. And the thing is, you were properly forewarned the whole and entire way of what would happen or what would become of you, meaning the entire race, if you didn't change the current trajectory you were and have remained on for the longest of time. All in all, there are no excuses, there are no legitimate reasons as to use or excuses as to why things are the way they are for all the way up to this point. Decisions and choices have been made to do things as we've done so, or not to do the necessary things as well, and have remained as we currently have as a culture. So that's all for this video, and again, thank you for tuning in to the Sober Thinkers channel, and we will see you on the next one. And remember to think wisely, think positively, and most importantly, think soberly.